So just to be clear, I define God as a necessary being with causal power.
You define God as a necessary being with what?
Causal power.
Alright, causal power.
Yeah.
Okay. Alright, so you define God as a necessary being with causal power.
Yeah, causal power, yeah. So he has the ability to cause certain phenomena.
Alright, certain phenomena. What are
Yeah.
these phenomena?
Well,
Can
like
you
he
name
just
them?
have the ability to, it doesn't matter what specifically the phenomena is, but the fact is just that he can cause a phenomena. But like the phenomena can vary, right? So you can like cause, for example, we'd say that he might be able to cause the universe. We might say that he might be able to cause a tear, for example, but the main idea is just that he can cause some phenomena, even though it's not always known what the phenomena is.
Okay. So, yeah, can you just give the argument for why a being that is necessary and has causal power exists?
Yeah, the arguments in general.
Okay. D1 is X is a contingent type. If X could have members and could fail to have members, D2 a type T is instantiated if T has at least one member. One for any contingent type, something could explain its instantiation. Two, being contingent is a contingent type. Call it C. Three, something could explain C's instantiation or whatever. Contingent things couldn't explain C's instantiation. Something could be non-contingent, but only if something is necessary. Something is necessary. So can you just explain how this proves God exists?
Because the seventh, because, well, the argument's obviously deductively valid, and the conclusion just follows from the former premises, right? And the conclusion is that a necessary being exists. And if a necessary being exists, then I just would have proved um, that obviously God exists because God is a necessary being.
I'm
Unless you want
sorry,
like a
but
specific justification for each of the premises. But yeah, if a necessary being exists, then obviously God exists, given how I defined God earlier.
I'm. So can you just prove like a necessary being exists? I mean, like, why can't the
It does
universe and
prove
all
that a
things
necessary
just be a
being
brute
exists.
fact? Wait,
Yeah, the
can you
argument
let me
does
talk?
prove that doesn't okay. So number one, the argument does prove that God exists, given that the argument is deductively valid, and given that the conclusion follows from the premises, given it's deductively valid. So if the conclusion follows from the premises and the conclusion is that a necessary being exists, then it would obviously follow that God exists, given that God is a necessary being. But to respond to one of the things you said about the universe being a brute fact, this argument doesn't reject the universe being a brute fact. It's just saying that there's some possible world where the universe or contingent things aren't brute. So it's basically saying that there might be some possible worlds where the universe or contingent things are brute, and there are other possible worlds where the universe and contingent things aren't brute. So basically just making a claim that it's logically possible for the universe to not be brute, right? Unless, and like, to deny that claim, you'd have to say that there's some contingent fact that is it's necessary that the contingent fact isn't explained. So it's logically impossible that the contingent fact is explained.
Okay, so in this case, just because all your premises follow up to the conclusion, I don't think that necessarily makes something true.
What did you say?
Just because the premises follow up to the conclusion doesn't necessarily make it true.
The
Like, for
conclusion follows from
example,
the premises.
wait, yeah, can you just let me talk? Can you let me give the example? So, for example, uh, let's say, oh my bad, bro. So for example, let's say my argument, right? Let's say my argument is that P1, your mom is a bitch. Let's say that. P2, your mom is a female dog. What's the analytical definition of a bitch? Conclusion. Therefore, your mom was a bitch. All the premises follow up to the conclusion, but that not necessarily doesn't mean your mom was a
Just
bitch.
begs that argument just begs the
How would
question
how
because the
what?
the premise because you have so one of the premises was obviously the premises literally the conclusion literally included one of the first the premise which was the first premise so the argument would bear the question but regardless of that that's not what I'm saying. What I'm basically saying is that given the argument's deductively valid and the conclusion falls from the premises, right, and you haven't called any of the premises into question, um that it would prove that a necessary being exists. And given that God is a necessary being, then it would prove that God exists. Now, like if you have like a contention with any of the premises, just let me know. But so far, you haven't contended why any of the premises are false. And for the brute fact objection that you already gave, I already told you that look, it is possible for the universe to be a brute fact, but I'd just reject the claim that it's necessary for the universe to be a brute fact. Now,
Okay,
the
wait,
argument
but
uses, yeah, okay.
if it's possible for the universe to be a brute fact, wouldn't that mean that God isn't necessary?
Mean that God isn't necessary because it would just mean that there exists some world where God exists and the universe exists, but God is not the explanation of the universe. So it would just be the type of God that doesn't causally interact with the universe, but he still has the ability to cause things. He just chooses, or for some reason, he didn't cause the universe. So it is compatible with the universe being a brute fact.
I'm saying, but still, are you saying that he's necessary in an ontological sense?
Yeah, I'm saying
Like, what
that
are you?
I'm saying that he's logically necessary, but it's not the case that it's logically necessary for him to explain or cause the universe. So his existence is logically necessary, but the existence of him does not entail that the universe also exists. So you can have a world where he exists, but it's not the case that the universe exists or the universe is caused by him, or if the universe does exist, like there's no direct entailment between his existence and the existence of the universe.
Okay, but can you also just go ahead and define logically necessary?
So biologically necessary would just mean that it would be a contradiction if God were to not exist. So it would be a logical contradiction in the form of P and not P if God were to not exist.
Wait, so how would it be a contradiction for God to not exist?
The argument explains that if you just read the premises.
Oh,
You just read the
okay.
premises, you should pay close attention to the premises. Um, you'll understand why that follows.
If something is okay, wait. So, but when you say something being non-contingent, like, what do you mean by this?
Well, being non-contingent would just mean being necessary in this case.
So you're saying being necessary in this case?
Yeah, so if it's non-contingent, then it would imply that it's necessary. So when it says that something could be non-contingent, it's just like a more convoluted or complicated way of saying that something could be necessary.
Okay, so anything non-contingent, you're saying that's necessary.
Well, in this case, yeah, because if you analyze the prior premises is basically just saying that this non-contingent thing in some world, not in the actual world, but in some world, causes like the existence of contingent things. Now, to say that something is non-contingent could either mean that it's impossible or it's necessary. Now, in this case, it has to be the case that it is necessary because we just established that there is some world in which it exists. So there is some world in which a non-contingent thing exists, but obviously an impossible thing can't exist in any world, and so it has to be a necessary being.
So being non-contingent in some world makes you God?
Yeah, could be a S5.
But what if in some world this being doesn't have any causal power?
It would be impossible because it's in its definition. Is There might be some world in which it doesn't cause anything, but ha but having some world where you don't cause anything is not the same thing as not having any causal power. It just that it chooses, or like there's some reason for why it doesn't cause anything.
Wait, so if it has the option to cause something but it doesn't cause anything, can you just explain like if for example, I'm just gonna give an example for what I'm trying to say. Basically, you said that it's impossible for something to have no causal power, but then you say that there's
That's not what I
some
said. I
place.
said that it would. I said that it would be impossible for the non-contingent thing to have no causal power because I already established that it's in the definition of a necessary thing or God to have causal power.
Wait,
And
I
since
mean, but
what? Yeah.
can you just tell me why your definition would be necessary though?
Mean, I don't understand what you mean by like, my definition would be necessary because like obviously you can have different semantics on how you like define like a certain word, but I'm just saying that look, the word that I'm using, I just define it in this way, but I don't know like what it would mean for a definition to be necessary, given that definitions don't express propositions. So like I don't know what it means for a definition to be necessary because they don't express propositions.
What do
Like
you think
a definition
expresses a
isn't the type of thing
proposition
that's
then?
true. So anything that expresses a proposition is just a thing which can either be true or false, but the definitions aren't the type of things which are true or false.
So
Like
definitions aren't the
you
type of
might say
things
like a
to be true or
definition doesn't
false.
account. Yeah, what did you say?
So you're saying that a definition doesn't have the power to be true or false.
Yeah, because it's not a proposition. You might say like a definition like doesn't account for what a thing is, but you wouldn't say that definition is true or false. You just said that it wouldn't be the best definition that we can use. Like there might be some better definition that we can use, right? But like in this case, when I'm talking about the existence of God, obviously people are gonna have their different conceptions of what God is, right? But if you like just accept that there is a necessary being with causal power, I think my work's been done here because not only is that like my conception of what God is, but it's also like a popular conception of what God is. Like there are many people who like hold this idea, and there are many philosophers who hold this idea that God is like a necessary being with causal power, right? So not only have I proved my conception of God, but I've also proved like a popular conception of God, which in my opinion like would be sufficient.
Wait, so how does something being popular lead to it being valid? Because, for example, let's say we have a world where everybody's Nazis. That doesn't necessarily make Nazis good or make Nazis
I love
valid.
rape.
Okay, I don't know why Gyro said that like that guy left off Apollo, but yeah, so that analogy wouldn't mean anything because there's no correlation between that analogy and what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that given that like there is this conception of God, or there is like this conceived definition of God, and I proved that such a being which falls in this definition exists, then I would have proved the popular conception of God. However, I'm not making a claim that like oh this definition of God would be like the best definition. But like, even then I don't know what it would mean for a definition of God to be the best definition, right? Because it doesn't seem that I think you'd only be able to say that unless like there was some prior belief, right? So let's say there was two Christians and the two Christians explaining, oh, what's the best definition of God? And then one Christian says that God is not omnipotent. You might say, okay, that definition should not be used because it's stated in the Bible that God is omnipotent. But in this case, there is no prior beliefs to dictate which definition would actually be like the best account. And so if there are no prior beliefs to dictate what definition is the best account, then I don't think that we can even say that there is a best definition in this scenario. I think that it would just be a case of look, which definition is like the more popular conception or which definition is are you using in your semantics? But like the
No,
analogy you
the
gave it
reason.
isn't correlative.
Wait, no, the analogy does correlate because it's just going to be displaying some sort of a negation to popularity leading to validity because you stated that your definition should be more valid than other
I never said that.
definitions due to its popularity.
Never
So then
said
what'd you
that.
say?
But okay. Okay, well, what I'm simply saying is that I'm simply just saying that there's a certain definition, and the definition is like a widely held, popular definition. And I'm saying that, okay, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to prove that such a being exists, that it falls under this definition, right? And so if I prove that such a being falls into this definition, then I would have proved a popular conception of God, right? And I think that's what's mostly meaningful in like theist debates. I think if I proved that a necessary concrete being exists, then I would have proved like a popular conception of what God is. And also like even I could even like bite the bullet and say that look, the more popular definition is, the more likely that it is true. That is actually true, right? Because like for example, take like the definitions of like basic things that we use, right? So take the definition of like an apple, and most people agree on the definition of an apple, and and therefore like our main evidence when trying to determine okay how do we define an apple is on how do we define what an apple is will actually be like how many people converge or agree on the idea of what an apple is. And so yeah, like in a lot of cases how people think the definition should be used are actually good indicators of like how we should actually use the definition, right? Because given like a lot of people agree on this definition.
I don't even think that proves that people agreeing on the definition makes it valid.
I never
Because
said it makes
then,
it valid.
yeah.
I'm saying that it would make it a better account. But I already told you
So,
that I
so
don't
it would
even
be a better account to take the Nazis in my analogy.
know because unless there is some definition that people widely converge or agree on, then like people don't widely or converge or agree that the definition of a Nazi is a good person. Nobody like agrees, or like very few people agree on that. But I'm saying the more amount of people that agree on the definition, the like more likely the definition is actually like a good definition, does actually capture what we're talking about. And so, but like hardly anybody agrees with like the like the idea that like Nazis are defined as good people.
No, that's not what I'm saying. When I gave you that analogy, I said, well, let's say there's a world, a possible world, where everybody agrees with the Nazis. Then, by your logic, it would logically follow to take that account of being a Nazi. That's what you
That's
said.
not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the amount of people that agree or the amount of people that converge on the idea increases the probability, but it is not going to be like this one-to-one equivalence with the popularity and with the truth. However, the probability is increased. It's just trivially true that the probability is increased, that the definition is a good account if a lot of people converge in the idea. So like maybe in that world, like the posterior probability of the definition being true is increased, but just because the posterior probability of the definition being true is increased, not being true, sorry, but being like the best account is increased, doesn't mean that like it actually is the best definition. And like even in worlds like those, like you can easily point out discrepancies with those kind of views, right? Because like you're gonna have to like give like the account of what good is, right? Because if it's the case that like the Nazis have done things that clearly aren't good, right? So let's say that like the Nazis have killed like 6 million people. Let's just say that they've done that. Um, and given those kind of evidence and data, we can come to the conclusion that like the Nazis aren't good people because we normally associate like killing and murder with things that are bad. Unless like in that world they also have a different definition of like killing and murder, but then we just go into an infinite regress of like these obscure definitions, like of these definitions that don't actually seem to capture reality. However, in like this world, we can like come to a conclusion via our intuitions and stuff like that, that the definition we do have about like good and like the definition we do have about like Nazis are like good definitions do capture reality because it's like most consistent with things like our induction, things with like empirical observation, things with our intuitions, and like we can use all those pieces of data and evidence to like come to a conclusion that look, this definition is like the best possible definition we could use. Hello. Like yeah, if you don't have any other questions, like yeah, yeah, yeah. We also Mercury uh,
Is that dude gone? What the fuck?
Wait, no, yeah, with Mercury, the argument wouldn't tell the necessary being has causal power, because if you scroll up, it says that the non-contingent thing or the necessary thing, like it possibly explains the contingent things, and obviously we're talking about causal explanation. So to possibly causal explain something, you must have causal potency.
Wait, should I save the record? Like, is he gonna come back?
Yeah, you can explanations. I'm talking about causal explanations. Or this argument in particular, like it's created by Josh Rasmussen. This argument in particular is caused by
Oh yeah, I'm back.
Okay, yeah. So if you want me to repeat what I said, like yeah, I can, but yeah.
Yeah, you can repeat what you said, cause
Okay,
my
so
internet.
what I'm basically saying is that like we have like multiple tools in like the actual to like determine whether a definition is the best account. So like we can use like our empirical observation, we can use like our intuitions, and like we can also use like external data and like about induction as well, right? So like take for example, somebody comes up to me and they say, okay, an apple is defined as maybe like a chair, right? And it might be the case that like under their semantics, like an apple is defined as a chair. Um, like they just slap the label apple on top of the label chair, and they say, okay, an apple is defined as a chair. But if they're referring to like the same type of apple that we're talking about, it's like if they're referring to like the fruit apple, then obviously that wouldn't be the case. So like it would also depend on like the type of things you're referring to when like you give the when you give like a definition of something, because it might be the case that you're not actually referring to the same object. However, if two of you are referring to the same object and he says an apple is a chair, and then you like give some actual like plant-based like definition of what an apple is, and he says that, oh, your definition not a good account, you can demonstrate that your definition is a good account by like going out into the external world, finding an apple, and then describing all the properties of the apple. And if it's the case that your definition is like more consistent with the properties of the apple, then we can come to the conclusion that your definition is probably the best account. But like in the case of, like the Nazi and like like the Nazis being good, for example, not only would like you have like an infinite regress of you having like to define the terms used in the proposition, but you'd also have to like demonstrate that it is the case in that possible world that like the properties that the Nazis have are best consistent with being good or something like that.
Low key, bro. I can see